She was 6 years old, found dead in her own basement on Christmas morning, duct tape over her mouth, a homemade garrote around her neck, and for 28 years, no one could prove who killed JonBenét Ramsey. The family was destroyed by accusations. The police chased dead ends. The DNA sat in a database unmatched, unexplained, taunting investigators for nearly 3 decades. But in 2025, that DNA finally started talking. Genetic genealogy, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer, has just been applied to JonBenét's case. And what it's revealing right now is sending shockwaves through the investigation. We're talking about breakthroughs happening as we speak, new suspects, forgotten leads, evidence that was buried for 28 years suddenly making sense. The person whose DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing, they're closer to being identified than ever before. And when that name drops, it's going to leave the world absolutely stunned. Before we dive into what's happening right now in 2025, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Because this case is about to crack wide open, and you need to hear every single detail. December 26th, 1996, 5:52 a.m. Patsy Ramsey's scream shattered the silence of the Boulder morning. She had walked downstairs to prepare for an early flight, a family vacation to their home in Charlevoix, Michigan, then on to a Disney cruise. The Christmas tree lights still glowed in the living room. Wrapping paper from the day before was scattered across the floor. Everything looked normal, peaceful, until she reached the spiral staircase. 3 pages of white-lined paper were laid out on the steps, handwritten, neat block letters, and the words made her blood run cold. Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We have your daughter in our possession. Patsy's hands shook as she grabbed the pages. Her eyes raced across the words, ransom, kidnapping, threats, instructions, and at the bottom 4 letters that would haunt investigators for decades. Victory. S. B. T. C. She ran to JonBenét's bedroom on the 2nd floor. The door was open. The bed was empty. Her daughter was gone. At 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey dialed 911. The call lasted 5 minutes and 25 seconds. Patsy's voice was frantic, hysterical, barely coherent. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please." The dispatcher tried to calm her down, tried to get details. John Ramsey could be heard in the background, his voice tense but controlled. The police were dispatched immediately. But here's what makes that 911 call so controversial: what was said after Patsy thought she hung up. Audio experts enhanced the recording years later, isolating sounds from those final seconds, and what they heard changed everything. 3 voices. John Ramsey, speaking in what experts described as a frustrated or angry tone. "We're not speaking to you." Patsy Ramsey, her voice suddenly calmer than the hysteria she'd displayed during the call, and a third voice, younger, a child's voice asking what sounded like, "What did you find?" That voice was likely Burke, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother. But according to John and Patsy, Burke was asleep upstairs during the 911 call. He didn't know anything was wrong. He never came downstairs. So why was his voice on that recording? The Ramseys would later explain that Burke may have woken up when he heard commotion, that they were trying to shield him from the horror of what was happening. But that explanation came years later, after the enhanced audio was analyzed, and by then, the damage was done. The inconsistency became one of dozens of questions that would never be fully answered. Within minutes, Boulder Police arrived at the Ramsey home. Officers began searching the house, while John and Patsy waited in the living room, surrounded by friends who had rushed over to support them. The ransom note said the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m., with instructions for delivering the money, exactly $118,000 in cash, placed in a brown paper bag and an adequate-sized attaché. That number, $118,000, was bizarre. Ransom demands are usually round numbers, 100,000, $500,000, $1 million, but $118,000. Investigators would later discover that John Ramsey's recent bonus from his company, Access Graphics, was $118,117.50, almost exactly the ransom amount. How would kidnappers know that? The note itself was unlike anything investigators had ever seen. 2.5 pages, handwritten on paper from a notepad in the Ramsey kitchen, using a Sharpie marker from the house. The language was theatrical, almost cinematic. We respect your business but not the country that it serves. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you. Use that good southern common sense of yours. It referenced John's business. It referenced his southern roots. It used phrases like foreign faction and countermeasures that sounded like they came from a spy movie. And the threats were constant, repetitive, almost performative. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. But here's what the police didn't know yet, what wouldn't be discovered until later that morning. Practice drafts. In the same notepad from which the ransom note pages were torn, investigators would find earlier pages where someone had started writing a ransom note, begun with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, then stopped, torn out those pages, and started over with just Mr. Ramsey. Someone had taken the time to draft and redraft this note. Someone had sat in the Ramsey kitchen while the family was in the house and carefully composed 2.5 pages of threats and instructions. Handwriting experts would later estimate it took 20 to 30 minutes to write. Think about that. After committing a violent crime, an intruder sat in the kitchen for half an hour, calmly writing and rewriting a ransom note using materials from the house, then carefully putting the notepad and pen back where they belonged before leaving. The risk is almost incomprehensible. At any moment, someone could have woken up, come downstairs, discovered them. Unless they knew, no one would wake up. Unless they knew they were safe. The 8 a.m. call never came. Neither did the 10 a.m. call. By late morning, Detective Linda Arndt, who was at the house, suggested that John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White search the house again just to see if they'd missed anything. At 1:05 p.m., John Ramsey opened the door to the wine cellar in the basement, and there, on the white concrete floor, partially covered with a white blanket, was his daughter. What time is it where you are right now? Let me know below. Before we go any further into what happened in that basement, you need to understand who JonBenét Ramsey was. Because she wasn't just a victim in a true crime case. She was a 6-year-old girl with a personality, a family, a life that was stolen from her on Christmas night. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia. Her name was a combination of her father's first and middle names, John Bennett, rearranged into something unique, something that would stand out. And stand out she did. By the time she was 6 years old, JonBenét had won multiple beauty pageant titles: Little Miss Colorado, National Tiny Miss Beauty, Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl. Videos of her at these pageants show a confident, energetic child who loved performing. She sang, she danced, she knew how to work a crowd, flashing that megawatt smile, striking poses with the confidence of someone 3 times her age. Her blonde hair was often styled in curls. Her makeup was professionally done: bright red lipstick, eyeshadow, blush, transforming her into a miniature adult. She wore elaborate costumes, sequined dresses, feather boas, cowboy outfits for Western-themed routines, and she seemed to love every second of it. But after her death, those same pageant videos became controversial. Critics argued that the pageants sexualized a young child, that the makeup and costumes were inappropriate, that JonBenét had been put on display in ways that could attract predators. The debate raged for years. Were the pageants harmless fun, a mother and daughter bonding over a shared interest, or were they something darker, something that made JonBenét a target? The truth is probably somewhere in between. JonBenét loved performing. Teachers and family friends described her as outgoing, energetic, someone who lit up when she had an audience. She wasn't being forced into pageants against her will. She genuinely enjoyed them. But that doesn't mean the pageants didn't play a role in what happened to her. JonBenét's family was prominent in Boulder's social circles. Her father, John Ramsey, was 53 years old in 1996, a self-made millionaire who had built Access Graphics, a computer services company, into a billion-dollar business. He was on his second marriage, had 3 older children from his first marriage, and had tragically lost his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, in a car accident in 1992. John was known as driven, successful, but also as a devoted father who doted on his children. He had money, status, respect. He was living the American dream. Patsy Ramsey, 40 years old, was John's second wife. She had been Miss West Virginia in 1977, a beauty queen herself who understood the pageant world intimately. After marrying John, she had focused on raising their two children, Burke and JonBenét, and supporting John's career. She was active in their church, involved in charity work, known throughout Boulder as a gracious hostess and a dedicated mother. Patsy had survived ovarian cancer in the early 1992s, a battle that had brought her face to face with her own mortality. Friends said the experience changed her, made her more intense, more determined to make every moment count. She threw herself into her children's lives, into social events, into creating the perfect family image. And then there was Burke, 9 years old in 1996, quiet, introspective, more comfortable with video games and model trains than with people. Teachers described him as polite but socially awkward, a child who preferred solitary activities to group play. He wasn't antisocial, just reserved, internal, the kind of kid who observed more than he participated. Burke and JonBenét had a typical sibling relationship. Sometimes they played together, sometimes they fought. Burke was the older brother, JonBenét the younger sister who got more attention, more spotlight, more of their mother's focus because of the pageants. Was there resentment, jealousy, or just normal sibling dynamics? That question would become critical later. Christmas Day 1996 started like any other holiday for the Ramseys. They woke up together, opened presents around the large Christmas tree in their living room. JonBenét got a bicycle that she rode briefly through the house, her laughter echoing off the walls. Burke received video games and other gifts he'd requested. The family had a light lunch, enjoyed each other's company in the relaxed atmosphere of Christmas morning. In the afternoon, they made brief visits to friends to exchange gifts and holiday greetings. And that evening, the main event, a Christmas party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends who lived nearby. The party was well attended, filled with families from the Ramseys' social circle. Children played together while adults mingled, ate, and celebrated. JonBenét wore a black velvet outfit with a red turtleneck underneath, looking festive and happy. She played with other children, ate some of the food that was served, and seemed to be having a wonderful time. Burke, true to his nature, stayed closer to the adults, played with his handheld video game, and generally kept to himself. Nothing about his behavior struck anyone as unusual. He was just Burke, being Burke. The Ramseys left the party around 9:30 p.m. and drove the short distance home. This is where the timeline becomes critical. According to John and Patsy, both children were exhausted. JonBenét fell asleep in the car during the brief drive, her head resting against the door, completely knocked out. John carried her from the car into the house and up to her bedroom on the second floor. Patsy said she helped change JonBenét into pajamas, long underwear, and an oversized white shirt without fully waking her. Burke, they said, went straight to his room and to bed. By 10:30 p.m., the lights in the house were off. Everyone was asleep. But here's the problem with that timeline. At some point during the night, JonBenét ate fresh pineapple. We know this because partially digested pineapple was found in her stomach during the autopsy. And a bowl of fresh pineapple with a large serving spoon was found on the kitchen table the next morning. Burke's fingerprints were on that bowl, and on a glass of iced tea sitting next to it. So at some point that night, Burke was in the kitchen with pineapple, and at some point, JonBenét ate pineapple, likely from that same bowl. Were they both awake? Both downstairs? Did something happen in those hours that the family never disclosed? The Ramseys have never been able to explain the pineapple satisfactorily. They suggested JonBenét might have gotten up by herself during the night. But the bowl was freshly prepared, sitting on the table with a serving spoon, not something a 6-year-old would typically do. What happened in those missing hours between 10:30 p.m. and dawn remains one of the biggest mysteries of this case. What we know for certain is this. JonBenét Ramsey was a vibrant, energetic, 6-year-old girl who loved performing, who had her whole life ahead of her. She had a family who loved her, friends who adored her, dreams that would never be realized. And on Christmas night, 1996, someone took all of that away. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now. This case is about to get even darker. What happened in the hours after John Ramsey discovered his daughter's body in that basement wine cellar is a masterclass in how not to conduct a criminal investigation. The Boulder Police Department had never handled a homicide case like this. Boulder, Colorado, was one of the safest cities in America, a college town nestled against the Rocky Mountains, known for hiking trails and coffee shops, not violent crime. The department had investigated maybe 1 or 2 homicides in the previous decade. They were unprepared, overwhelmed, and they made mistakes that would haunt this case for nearly 3 decades. The first mistake: the crime scene was contaminated before investigators even realized they were dealing with a homicide. When police first arrived at 5:52 a.m., they treated it as a kidnapping. The ransom note said JonBenét had been taken. So officers searched the house, but not thoroughly, not systematically. They were looking for signs of forced entry, evidence of an intruder, clues about where the kidnappers might have gone. They weren't treating the house as a crime scene because they didn't think a crime had been committed there. The Ramseys were allowed to call friends. Within an hour, the house was filled with people. Reverend Roll Hoverstock from their church, Fleet and Priscilla White, who had hosted the Christmas party the night before, John and Barbara Fernie, close family friends. These people walked through the house, touched surfaces, moved objects, trying to comfort John and Patsy, trying to help. No one was controlling access. No one was documenting who went where. No one was preserving evidence. By the time John Ramsey found JonBenét's body at 1:05 p.m., more than 7 hours after police arrived, the crime scene was hopelessly compromised. And then it got worse. When John found JonBenét in the wine cellar, he didn't leave her there. He picked her up, carried her upstairs, and laid her on the living room floor. Fleet White, who was with him, helped remove the duct tape from her mouth. John's instinct as a father was to hold his daughter, to try to help her, even though it was clear she was gone. But from an investigative standpoint, it was a disaster. The body had been moved. The crime scene had been altered. Evidence had been touched, contaminated, destroyed. Fibers from John's clothing were now on JonBenét's body. His DNA was under her fingernails from when he carried her. The chain of custody was broken before it even began. Detective Linda Arndt, who was the primary officer at the scene that afternoon, would later testify that she felt overwhelmed and outnumbered. She was alone with multiple people in the house, a body that had just been discovered, and no backup. She made the decision to keep everyone in the living room, to not let anyone leave. But by then, the damage was done. The Boulder Police Department called in reinforcements, but it was too late. The first 24 hours of an investigation are critical. Evidence degrades, memories fade, suspects flee. And in this case, those first 24 hours were spent treating a homicide like a kidnapping, allowing contamination of the crime scene and failing to secure basic evidence. But the mistakes didn't stop there. The ransom note became an obsession for investigators, and the more they analyzed it, the more bizarre it became. Handwriting experts were brought in to compare the note to samples from John and Patsy Ramsey, from friends, from anyone who had access to the house. The results were inconclusive, or rather, they were conclusive depending on which expert you asked. Some experts said the handwriting was consistent with Patsy's. They pointed to specific letter formations, the way certain letters looped and connected, the overall style. One expert said there was a 4.5 out of 5 probability that Patsy wrote it. Other experts said the handwriting definitively was not Patsy's. They noted key differences in letter spacing, pressure, slant. One expert hired by the Ramsey defense team said Patsy could be eliminated as the writer with near certainty. The same evidence, completely opposite conclusions, but here's what everyone agreed on. Whoever wrote that note took their time. The practice drafts found in the notepad proved that. Someone had started writing Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, stopped, torn out those pages, and started over with just Mr. Ramsey. Then they wrote 2.5 pages in neat, careful block letters, 20 to 30 minutes, minimum. Think about the scenario if an intruder wrote this note. They would have had to break into the house, locate JonBenét, commit the crime, then sit down in the kitchen while the family slept upstairs and spend half an hour writing and rewriting a ransom note using materials from the house. Then they would have had to carefully place the note on the staircase, put the notepad and pen back where they belonged, and leave without being detected. The risk is staggering. At any moment, someone could have woken up, come downstairs for water, heard something, and the intruder would have been caught. Unless they knew the family's routines, unless they knew no one would wake up, unless they had been in the house before and felt comfortable there, or unless someone in the family wrote it. That's what Boulder Police believed, and that belief shaped everything that came next. The autopsy results only deepened the mystery. JonBenét had suffered 2 catastrophic injuries, A massive skull fracture 8.5 inches long, running from the right side of her head toward the back. The force required to cause this injury was enormous, equivalent to being struck with a baseball bat or a heavy flashlight, or falling from a significant height onto concrete. What made this injury so unusual was that there was almost no external evidence of it. No significant bruising on the scalp, no open wound, no blood on the outside. The blow had fractured her skull and caused massive hemorrhaging in the brain tissue, but it hadn't broken the skin. This suggested the weapon had a relatively broad, smooth surface. A flashlight which was found on the Ramsey kitchen counter that morning matched this profile perfectly. The second injury was the garrote. A cord had been wrapped around JonBenét's neck and attached to a stick later identified as part of a paintbrush from Patsy Ramsey's art supplies in the basement. The stick had been twisted, tightening the cord, creating deep furrows in JonBenét's neck, ultimately causing death by asphyxiation. The construction of this device became a point of intense debate. Some experts said it showed sophistication, knowledge, possibly military or survival training. Others said anyone could have made it, that similar devices appear in movies and books, that it could have been constructed by someone following instinct or panic. But the biggest debate was about the order of injuries. Which came first, the head blow or the strangulation? Some forensic pathologists believed the head blow came first, that it rendered JonBenét unconscious or comatose, and that the strangulation came later, possibly 45 minutes to 2 hours later. The evidence for this theory included the lack of defensive wounds. If JonBenét was already unconscious from the head injury, she wouldn't have fought back against the strangulation. Other experts believed the strangulation came first, or that both injuries occurred close together in time. They pointed to evidence that JonBenét's heart was still beating during the strangulation, petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, signs of struggle in her system. Why does this matter? Because different timelines support different theories about what happened. If the head blow came first, and there was a significant gap before the strangulation, it suggests someone discovered JonBenét injured, maybe from an accident, maybe from a blow delivered in anger, and then made a decision about what to do next. The strangulation and the ransom note could have been staging, an attempt to make it look like an intruder kidnapping gone wrong. If both injuries happened close together, it suggests a more deliberate, planned attack. An intruder who came to the house with intent to harm. The autopsy also noted injuries that some experts interpreted as evidence of sexual assault, both chronic inflammation that could indicate prior abuse and acute injuries that appeared recent. This became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Some medical examiners who reviewed the findings believed the evidence clearly indicated ongoing abuse prior to her death. Others argued the findings could be explained by other factors, normal childhood irritation, the trauma of the assault itself, and that definitive conclusions weren't warranted. If JonBenét was being abused prior to her death, it pointed to someone with ongoing access to her, someone in the family or very close to the family. If the assault occurred only on the night of her death, it supported the intruder theory, a predator who broke in specifically to assault and ultimately harm her. The truth remains disputed to this day. And then there was the pineapple problem. During the autopsy, partially digested pineapple was found in JonBenét's stomach, fresh pineapple. Based on the state of digestion, forensic pathologists estimated she had eaten it approximately 2 to 3 hours before her death. But according to John and Patsy, JonBenét went straight to bed when they got home from the Christmas party, around 9:45 p.m. She was asleep in the car. John carried her upstairs. Patsy changed her into pajamas. She never woke up. She never went back downstairs. So how did she eat fresh pineapple? The bowl found on the kitchen table the next morning made it even more suspicious. Fresh pineapple with a large serving spoon, and Burke's fingerprints were on the bowl and on a glass of iced tea sitting next to it. The Ramseys couldn't explain it. They suggested maybe JonBenét got up by herself during the night and ate some, but the bowl was freshly prepared, sitting on the table, not something a 6-year-old would typically do for herself. Burke was asked about it in interviews years later. He said he didn't remember. Maybe he had a snack that night. Maybe he didn't. He couldn't say for sure, but his fingerprints were on that bowl. Which means at some point that night, Burke was awake and in the kitchen. And at some point, JonBenét ate pineapple, likely from that same bowl. Were they both awake? Both downstairs? Did something happen between them that the family never disclosed? The enhanced 911 call added another layer to this mystery. In 2016, audio experts used new technology to analyze the final seconds of Patsy's 911 call, the moments after she believed she had hung up. What they heard was stunning. 3 voices. John Ramsey, speaking in what experts described as a frustrated or angry tone. "We're not speaking to you." Patsy Ramsey, her voice calmer than the hysteria she'd displayed during the call itself. And a younger voice, Burke, asking what sounded like, "What did you find?" But John and Patsy had always maintained that Burke was asleep during the 911 call, that he didn't know anything was wrong, that he never came downstairs. So why was his voice on that recording? Years later, Burke addressed this in interviews. He said he may have been awake, may have come downstairs when he heard noise or commotion. His parents may have been trying to shield him from what was happening, asking him to go back upstairs. He characterized any inconsistencies as innocent confusion in a traumatic situation. But the damage was done. The inconsistency became evidence of something more sinister in the minds of investigators and the public. And here's where the investigation went completely off the rails. The Boulder Police Department developed tunnel vision. They became convinced that someone in the Ramsey family was responsible, and once they reached that conclusion, they stopped looking elsewhere. Leads that pointed away from the family were ignored or minimized. Potential suspects who had access to the house or connections to JonBenét were interviewed briefly and then dropped. The investigation became about proving the family's guilt rather than following the evidence wherever it led. John and Patsy were treated as suspects from the beginning. They were asked to come to the police station for interviews. They were asked to provide handwriting samples, fingerprints, DNA. They hired lawyers, which made them look guilty in the eyes of the public and the police. Burke was interviewed multiple times, including sessions with child psychologists. He was 9 years old, and he was being questioned about whether he had hurt his sister. The media frenzy was relentless. The case became a national obsession. Tabloids ran wild with theories. Cable news devoted hours to speculation. The Ramseys were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before any charges were ever filed. And through it all, the Boulder Police Department remained focused on the family. But 3 suspects were never properly investigated, and in 2025, a retired detective finally spoke out about it. What's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Rainy? Drop it in the comments. In early 2025, a bombshell revelation emerged that sent shockwaves through the true crime community and reignited public outrage over how the JonBenét Ramsey case was handled. A former Boulder detective who worked the case in the late 1992, now retired and no longer bound by department politics, gave an interview to a major news outlet, and what he revealed was damning. According to this detective, there were multiple leads in the original investigation that pointed away from the Ramsey family and toward potential intruders. Leads that were never properly followed up. Leads that were essentially abandoned because the department's focus on the family was so intense, so all-consuming, that other investigative avenues were ignored. Specifically, this detective identified 3 individuals who had connections to the Ramsey family or to JonBenét, who had troubling backgrounds, and who were in the Boulder area on Christmas night 1996. These individuals were interviewed briefly in the initial investigation, but they were never thoroughly investigated. Their alibis were never properly verified, and critically, DNA samples were never obtained from any of them. Now, nearly 3 decades later, there's renewed interest in tracking down these individuals and determining whether they have any connection to the crime. Let's talk about who they are. In the months leading up to JonBenét's death, the Ramsey family had work done on their home. Renovations, repairs, updates. Multiple contractors and workers had access to the house during this period. One of these contractors became a person of interest early in the investigation, but only briefly. This individual had worked on the Ramsey home for several weeks. He knew the layout intimately. He knew where the bedrooms were located. He knew about the basement. He knew the family's routines because he had been there during the day, observing their comings and goings. Background checks revealed a troubling history. This contractor had prior arrests in another state, petty crimes, theft, and critically, a breaking and entering charge that had resulted in probation. When investigators interviewed him in the days after JonBenét's death, he provided an alibi for Christmas night. He said he was with family. He said he was nowhere near Boulder. He seemed cooperative, answered questions, and was sent on his way. But here's what didn't happen. No one verified his alibi. No one contacted the family members he claimed to be with. No one checked phone records, credit card transactions, or any other evidence that could confirm his whereabouts. And no one asked for a DNA sample. According to the retired detective who spoke out in 2025, this contractor simply disappeared from the investigation. His name appeared in early reports, but there was no follow-up, no second interview, no attempt to dig deeper. Why? Because by that point, the Boulder Police Department had already decided the family was responsible. Resources were being devoted to building a case against John, Patsy, or Burke. Other leads were considered distractions. Now, in 2025, investigators are attempting to locate this contractor, who would now be in his 50 seconds or 60 seconds to obtain a DNA sample and either clear him definitively or pursue him as a suspect. But nearly 3 decades have passed. People move, people change names, people die. Finding him won't be easy. The Ramsey family was active in St. John's Episcopal Church in Boulder. Patsy was particularly involved, organizing charity events, volunteering for various church activities, bringing JonBenét to services and functions. One individual who attended the same church and volunteered at some of Patsy's charity events caught the attention of investigators early on, but again, only briefly. Multiple witnesses reported that this person had shown what they described as unusual interest in JonBenét. He would ask questions about her. Where does she go to school? Where does the family live? Does she do activities outside of church? At the time, these questions might have seemed like innocent small talk, someone being friendly, showing interest in a child from the congregation. But after JonBenét's death, those same witnesses remembered the questions differently. They remembered feeling slightly uncomfortable. They remembered thinking it was odd that this person was so focused on JonBenét specifically. This individual had been present at several events where JonBenét performed or appeared. Church functions, charity fundraisers. He would have seen her in her pageant outfits, heard her sing, watched her interact with other children and adults. When investigators interviewed him in the initial investigation, he expressed shock and sadness about JonBenét's death. He said he barely knew the family. He said he was just a casual acquaintance from church. He provided an alibi for Christmas night. He said he was at home with his wife, and that was the end of it. No follow-up, no verification of the alibi, no DNA sample. According to the retired detective, this individual's name appeared in reports with a note that he had been cleared, but there was no documentation of how he was cleared, no record of anyone actually verifying his alibi or investigating further. He simply vanished from the investigation. Now, in 2025, there are questions about whether this person's interest in JonBenét was as innocent as it seemed, whether his presence at multiple events was coincidental or deliberate, whether he knew more about the Ramsey family's schedule and routines than he let on. Investigators are attempting to locate him for a DNA sample, but like the contractor, he's proven difficult to find. He no longer attends St. John's Episcopal Church. He may have moved out of state, he may have changed his name, or he may be hiding. This one is perhaps the most disturbing. According to the retired detective, there was an individual who lived in the Ramseys' neighborhood, not immediately adjacent to their home, but within a few blocks, who had a criminal history involving children in another state. This history was discovered during background checks in the initial investigation. The crimes were serious enough that this person should have been a priority suspect, but he wasn't. When investigators interviewed him, he provided an alibi for Christmas night. He said he was at home with family members. Those family members confirmed his alibi when questioned. And that was it. Case closed. Suspect cleared. But here's the problem. Alibis provided by family members are notoriously unreliable. Family members lie to protect each other. They misremember. They convince themselves that their loved one couldn't possibly be involved, so they provide the alibi the person needs. Modern investigators would never simply accept a family alibi without corroboration. They would check phone records, security camera footage, credit card transactions, anything that could independently verify the person's whereabouts. But in 1996, with the Boulder Police Department focused entirely on the Ramsey family, this individual's family alibi was accepted at face value. No follow-up, no corroboration, no DNA sample. He disappeared from the investigation, his name buried in reports that wouldn't be reviewed again for decades. Now, in 2025, there are serious questions about whether this person's alibi was legitimate, whether his family members were telling the truth, whether he had the opportunity to commit this crime, and critically, whether his DNA matches the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. Investigators are attempting to locate him, but like the others, he's proven elusive. He no longer lives in Boulder. Records show he moved out of state in the late 1992 shortly after JonBenét's death. Coincidence or flight? The revelation's impact. When this retired detective's interview was published in early 2025, the response was immediate and furious. Victims' advocates demanded answers. How could three individuals with troubling backgrounds and connections to the case be essentially ignored? How could their alibis be accepted without verification? How could DNA samples not be obtained? True crime communities erupted with theories and speculation. Online forums dissected every detail of the three suspects. Amateur investigators tried to identify them based on the limited information available, and the pressure on the Boulder Police Department intensified exponentially. The department released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that they are reviewing all investigative files and attempting to locate and re-interview individuals who were persons of interest in the original investigation. They confirmed that efforts are underway to obtain voluntary DNA samples from these individuals, but they haven't provided specifics. They haven't said whether any of these three suspects have been located. They haven't said whether DNA samples have been obtained or tested. The silence is deafening, and it raises an uncomfortable question. What if one of these three men is the killer? What if the answer to this 28-year mystery was sitting in the original investigation files all along, ignored because investigators were too focused on the family to see it? Current status. As of early 2025, here's what we know. The Boulder Police Department has confirmed they are attempting to locate the three individuals identified by the retired detective. At least one of them has been located and contacted. Investigators have requested a voluntary DNA sample, but it's unclear whether that request has been fulfilled. The other two remain unlocated, though investigators are working with agencies in other states to track them down. If DNA samples are obtained, they will be compared against the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. If there's a match, it would be the breakthrough this case has needed for 28 years. If there's no match, these individuals can be definitively cleared and the investigation continues. But here's what makes this even more significant. Even if these three specific individuals aren't the killer, their cases expose a fundamental flaw in the original investigation. How many other leads were ignored? How many other potential suspects were dismissed because they didn't fit the narrative that the family was responsible? The answer to who killed JonBenét Ramsey might have been found decades ago if investigators had followed every lead instead of focusing exclusively on one theory. One of these men could be the killer. But there's something even more shocking. Because while investigators are scrambling to track down these forgotten suspects, there's another breakthrough happening simultaneously, one that doesn't require finding anyone, one that uses DNA that's been sitting in evidence for 28 years, and it's called genetic genealogy. In 1997, forensic scientists with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation made a discovery that should have solved this case decades ago. Unknown male DNA. It was found in two locations on JonBenét's clothing, in the crotch of her underwear, mixed with her blood, and on the waistband of her long johns, the pajama bottoms she was wearing when her body was discovered. The DNA profile was clear enough to analyze. It belonged to a male. But it didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family. Not John, not Burke. Not any male relative, friend, or person who had legitimate access to the house. This was someone else, someone unknown. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a massive database containing millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scenes across the country. When a new profile is added to CODIS, it's automatically compared against every existing profile in the system. If there's a match, investigators are notified immediately. For 28 years, this DNA profile has been sitting in CODIS. It's been compared against every new profile that gets added, thousands upon thousands of comparisons over nearly 3 decades, and in 28 years, there has never been a single match. Not even a partial match. Not even a familial match that might provide an investigative lead. Nothing. Whoever left that DNA on JonBenét's clothing has never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA collection. They've never been convicted of a felony. They've never submitted their DNA voluntarily to any database. Or they're dead, or they're living quietly, completely undetected, while the Ramsey family has been destroyed by suspicion and accusation. From the moment this DNA was discovered, it became the most controversial piece of evidence in the case, and the debate over what it means has raged for 28 years. The Ramsey defender's position: this DNA proves an intruder killed JonBenét, period. Unknown male DNA, found in intimate locations on her body, mixed with her blood. This isn't coincidental. This isn't innocent transfer DNA. This is the killer's DNA. The fact that it doesn't match anyone in the family definitively rules them out. The fact that it's been in CODIS for 28 years without matching anyone proves the killer is someone with no prior criminal record, someone who has evaded detection, someone outside the family's circle. John Ramsey has been saying this for decades. His lawyers have been saying it. His supporters have been saying it. The DNA is the answer. Find the person who matches that DNA, and you find JonBenét's killer. The skeptic's position: not so fast. The DNA found on JonBenét's clothing was what's called touch DNA, or trace DNA, a very small amount of genetic material that could have been deposited in numerous innocent ways. Underwear is manufactured in factories where dozens of workers handle the fabric. It's packaged and shipped through distribution centers where more people touch it. It's displayed in stores where customers and employees handle it. Any of these people could have left trace amounts of DNA that ended up on the underwear JonBenét wore that night. The same is true for the long johns. Touch DNA can be transferred through multiple degrees of separation. If person A shakes hands with person B, and person B then touches an object, person A's DNA can end up on that object without person A ever directly touching it. So the mere presence of unknown male DNA doesn't prove that person was in the Ramsey house that night. It doesn't prove they had any contact with JonBenét. It could be completely unrelated to the crime. This debate reached a boiling point in 2008 when Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey made a stunning decision. She officially exonerated the Ramsey family. In a letter sent to John Ramsey, Lacey apologized for the years of suspicion and stated that new DNA testing had cleared the family of any involvement in JonBenét's death. She said the DNA evidence pointed clearly to an intruder and that the family should no longer be considered suspects. The decision was immediately controversial. Many investigators, including some who had worked the case, disagreed vehemently. They argued that the DNA evidence was far from conclusive, that exonerating the family based on touch DNA that could have innocent explanations was premature and irresponsible. The Boulder Police Department issued a statement saying they did not agree with the exoneration. They maintained that the investigation was ongoing and that all possibilities remained open. But the damage or the vindication, depending on your perspective, was done. The Ramsey family had been officially cleared by the district attorney's office. John Ramsey called it a bittersweet moment. His wife, Patsy, had died of ovarian cancer in 2006, 2 years before the exoneration. She never got to see her name cleared. She died still under suspicion, still fighting to prove her innocence. For John, the exoneration was validation, but it wasn't justice, because the person whose DNA was on his daughter's clothing was still out there, still unidentified, still free. And for the next 16 years, that's where the case sat, unsolved. The DNA in CODIS, generating no hits. The investigation essentially stalled, until genetic genealogy changed everything. The game changer: genetic genealogy. In April 2018, the true crime world was rocked by an announcement that seemed impossible. The Golden State Killer had been caught. Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer, was arrested at his home in Sacramento, California. He was charged with multiple counts of murder and rape connected to a crime spree that had terrorized California in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. DeAngelo had committed at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. He was one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history, and he had evaded capture for more than 40 years. His DNA had been in CODIS since the early 2000s. But like the JonBenét Ramsey DNA, it had never matched anyone. So how was he caught? Genetic genealogy. Investigators took DeAngelo's DNA profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people who have taken consumer DNA tests through companies like Ancestry and 23andMe can upload their results to find relatives. DeAngelo himself had never taken a DNA test, but distant relatives of his had: third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared genetic markers with him but had never met him, didn't know him, had no idea they were related to a serial killer. When D'Angelo's DNA was uploaded to GEDmatch, it matched these distant relatives. Genetic genealogists then built family trees, working backward and forward through generations, tracing lineages, narrowing the pool of potential suspects. Within a few months, they had identified D'Angelo as a likely match. Investigators obtained his DNA from a discarded item, a tissue from his trash, and confirmed it matched the crime scene DNA. He was arrested, he eventually pleaded guilty, and he's now serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Golden State Killer case proved that genetic genealogy wasn't just theoretical, it was devastatingly effective, and it opened the floodgates. Since 2018, genetic genealogy has been used to solve more than 200 cold cases. Murders that went unsolved for 30, 40, even 50 years have been cracked in a matter of months using this technique. The Christy Mirax case in Washington solved after 32 years. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg murders solved after 30 years. The April Tinsley case in Indiana solved after 30 years. Case after case after case, once considered hopeless, solved using genetic genealogy. The technique works because of how widespread consumer DNA testing has become. Millions of people have taken DNA tests through Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and other companies. Many have uploaded their results to public databases like GEDmatch. Studies have shown that for people of European descent, which represents the majority of people in these databases, over 60%, can be connected to someone within 6 degrees of separation through genetic genealogy. That means if you're of European descent, there's a better than even chance that a distant relative of yours has taken a DNA test and uploaded it to a public database. And if you commit a crime and leave DNA behind, investigators can potentially trace that DNA back to you through those distant relatives. It's revolutionary, it's powerful, and it should have been applied to the JonBenét Ramsey case years ago. So why wasn't it? The stonewalling. John Ramsey has been asking this question publicly since 2018. Why hasn't genetic genealogy been used on the DNA from JonBenét's case? The Boulder Police Department's response has been frustratingly vague. They've said the investigation is ongoing. They've said various forensic techniques are being considered. They've said decisions about testing will be made at the appropriate time, but they haven't done it. Critics, including John Ramsey, victims' advocates, and even some former investigators believe the reason is simple. The Boulder Police Department is afraid of being proven wrong. For 28 years, the department has maintained that the family was involved. They've built their theory around family guilt. They've invested decades of resources, reputation, and credibility into that narrative. If genetic genealogy identifies an intruder, someone completely outside the family, it proves the investigation was fundamentally misdirected from the beginning. It proves the tunnel vision was real. It proves the Ramsey family was wrongly accused and persecuted for nearly 3 decades. That's a devastating admission for any law enforcement agency to make. So, instead of risking that outcome, the Boulder Police Department has simply waited, delayed, avoided making a decision. But in 2024, the pressure finally became too much to ignore. 2024 to 2025. The breakthrough, John Ramsey, now 81 years old, launched a public pressure campaign unlike anything he'd done before. He appeared on major news networks, he gave interviews to podcasts and documentaries, he wrote op-eds, he met with lawmakers, he did everything in his power to force the Boulder Police Department to act. His message was simple and direct. Use genetic genealogy. Test the DNA. Find the killer. He wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. And he wasn't alone. Victims' advocates joined the campaign. True crime communities rallied behind him. Petitions were circulated online, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures. The pressure was relentless. In late 2024, something shifted. The Boulder Police Department released a statement carefully worded, non-committal, but significant nonetheless. They acknowledged that they are exploring advanced DNA testing options, including genetic genealogy. For years, they had refused to even discuss genetic genealogy publicly. Now, they were admitting it was under consideration. It was a crack in the wall. And John Ramsey pushed harder. In December 2024, sources close to the investigation began leaking information to the media. According to these sources, The Boulder Police Department had quietly begun consulting with genetic genealogy experts. Discussions were underway about how to properly extract, prepare, and upload the DNA for genealogical analysis. This represented a massive shift in the department's position, a shift driven by public pressure, by the proven success of genetic genealogy in other cases, and by the reality that key figures in the case, including John Ramsey himself, are aging and want resolution before it's too late. In early 2025, the leaks became more specific. Sources confirmed that DNA samples are being prepared, that consultations with experts are ongoing, that there is real movement happening behind the scenes. The Boulder Police Department hasn't confirmed these reports officially, but they haven't denied them either. And for the first time in 28 years, there is genuine hope that this case might actually be solved. This is where it gets insane. Make sure you're still with me. Drop a like if you want justice for JonBenét. Because genetic genealogy doesn't just offer hope, it offers a roadmap. If the DNA is uploaded to genealogy databases and distant relatives are found, genetic genealogists can build family trees. They can trace lineages. They can narrow the pool of potential suspects from millions of people down to dozens, then to a handful, then to one. The Golden State Killer case took about 4 months from when the DNA was uploaded to when Joseph DeAngelo was identified. Other cases have taken longer, 6 months to a year, depending on the complexity of the family trees and how distant the genetic connections are. But compared to 28 years of frustration and dead ends, even a year would be lightning fast. And when that name is finally identified, when investigators finally know whose DNA was on JonBenét's clothing, everything changes. Was this person connected to the family in some way? Did they have legitimate access to the house? Were they at the Christmas party? Did they work on the house at some point? Or were they a complete stranger, a predator who targeted JonBenét from afar? The identity of that person will immediately reshape our understanding of this entire case. But genetic genealogy isn't the only breakthrough happening right now, because while the DNA is being prepared for testing, other forensic advances are revealing new evidence that's been hiding in plain sight for 28 years. While the world waits for genetic genealogy results, a quiet revolution has been happening in forensic laboratories across the country. Evidence collected from the JonBenét Ramsey crime scene in 1996, evidence that was analyzed with the best technology available at the time, is being re-examined using techniques that didn't exist even 5 years ago. And what these new analyses are revealing is stunning. New fiber analysis, the carpet that wasn't there. In 1996, forensic technicians collected hundreds of fiber samples from JonBenét's body and clothing. These fibers were examined under microscopes, categorized by type and color, and compared against known sources: clothing worn by family members, carpets and fabrics in the Ramsey home, items from the cars. Most of the fibers were matched and explained, but some weren't. In 2024, these unmatched fibers were subjected to new analysis using advanced spectroscopy and chemical composition testing that can identify not just the type of fiber, but the specific manufacturing process, the dye composition, even the approximate time period when the material was produced. The results were significant. Several fibers found on JonBenét's body have been identified as coming from a specific type of carpet that was not present anywhere in the Ramsey home. This carpet fiber type was commonly used in commercial buildings and vehicles in the 1992, office buildings, hotels, vans and SUVs, but not in residential homes like the Ramseys. This means JonBenét came into contact with this type of carpet at some point before her death, or someone who had been in contact with this carpet touched her body or clothing. Investigators are now working to determine where JonBenét might have encountered this carpet. Was it at the Christmas party the family attended that evening? Was it in a vehicle? Was it brought into the Ramsey home by someone who had walked on this type of carpet elsewhere? Researchers are examining the locations the Ramsey family visited on December 25th, the homes of friends, the church, anywhere JonBenét might have been, to see if any had this specific type of carpet. They're also looking at vehicles. Did any of the contractors who worked on the Ramsey home drive vans or SUVs with this type of carpet? Did any of the people at the Christmas party? It's painstaking work, but it's the type of detailed investigation that can sometimes produce unexpected breakthroughs, because if they can identify where this carpet was located, they can identify who had access to it, and that could lead directly to a suspect. Hair evidence re-examined, mitochondrial DNA. Hair samples collected from the crime scene in 1996 were examined microscopically and compared against known samples from family members and others. Some were matched, others weren't. The problem with hair evidence is that without the root attached, it's very difficult to extract nuclear DNA, the type of DNA that can definitively identify a specific individual. But there's another type of DNA that can be extracted from hair shafts: mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is less specific than nuclear DNA. It's inherited maternally, which means everyone in a maternal lineage shares the same mitochondrial DNA. You have the same mitochondrial DNA as your mother's mother, your mother's siblings, and so on. So mitochondrial DNA can't identify a specific person the way nuclear DNA can, but it can narrow the pool, it can exclude people, and it can provide investigative leads. In 2024, forensic scientists successfully extracted mitochondrial DNA from several hair samples that were collected from JonBenét's body and clothing, but were never definitively sourced. This mitochondrial DNA has been analyzed and profiled. It doesn't match anyone in the Ramsey family's maternal lineage. So whose hair is it? Right now, investigators don't know. But if a suspect is identified through genetic genealogy or through other investigative means, this mitochondrial DNA can be compared against that person's profile. If it matches, it's powerful corroborating evidence that places that person in direct contact with JonBenét. If it doesn't match, it could exclude them as a suspect. Either way, it's another piece of the puzzle that's finally being put into place. 3D, digital reconstruction, walking through the crime. One of the most innovative forensic techniques being applied to this case is 3D digital reconstruction. Using crime scene photographs, architectural plans, measurements, and other documentation, forensic specialists have created a complete digital replica of the Ramsey home as it existed in 1996. This isn't just a floor plan or a diagram. It's a fully immersive 3D model that allows investigators to virtually walk through the house, room by room, exactly as it was on the night of December 25th, 1996. Why does this matter? Because it allows investigators to test theories about how an intruder might have moved through the space. The intruder theory has always required a complex sequence of events. An intruder would have had to enter the house most likely through the basement window, which showed signs of possible disturbance. They would have had to navigate through the basement, up the stairs, through the main floor, up another flight of stairs to the second floor, where JonBenét's bedroom was located. Then, after the crime, they would have had to carry or lead JonBenét back down 2 flights of stairs to the basement wine cellar where her body was found. All of this while the family was sleeping in the house. The 3D model allows investigators to calculate exactly how long this journey would take, how much noise it would make, creaking stairs, opening doors, footsteps on hardwood floors, how risky it would be. The results have been eye-opening. The path from the basement window to JonBenét's bedroom and back to the wine cellar is long and complex. It requires navigating multiple rooms, passing by the master bedroom where John and Patsy were sleeping, moving through areas where any noise could have woken someone. The 3D model shows that this journey would take approximately 8 to 12 minutes, assuming the intruder knew exactly where they were going and moved quickly but carefully. That's a long time to be in a house where 4 people are sleeping. A long time to risk discovery. Some investigators looking at this model have concluded that an intruder entering through the basement window makes the crime much more difficult and risky than previously thought. The complexity of the route, the number of potential points where they could be discovered, the time required, it all suggests that if an intruder did this, they were either incredibly bold or incredibly familiar with the house. Other investigators believe the model actually supports the intruder theory. The complex layout of the house provided multiple hiding spots. The thick carpeting in many areas would have muffled footsteps. An intruder who had been in the house before, perhaps as a contractor, a delivery person, a guest at a party, could have known the layout well enough to navigate it in the dark. The model has also been used to analyze the ransom note writing scenario. If an intruder wrote the note, they would have needed to be in the house for an extended period. The kitchen, where the notepad and pen were kept, is on the main floor, visible from multiple angles. Someone sitting at the kitchen table writing would be exposed. Anyone coming downstairs would see them immediately. The 3D model shows exactly where this person would have been positioned, what they could see and hear from that position, and how exposed they would have been to discovery. This analysis has led some investigators to question whether it's plausible that an intruder would take such a risk. Why not write the note before entering the house? Why not write it after leaving? Why sit in the kitchen for 20 to 30 minutes, completely exposed, writing and rewriting a ransom note? The only explanation that makes sense is that the note was written by someone who knew they wouldn't be discovered, someone who lived in the house, or someone who knew the family's sleeping patterns so well that they were confident no one would wake up. Garrote cord traced. Following the evidence. The cord used to strangle JonBenét has been one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case. In 1996, investigators determined it was a white nylon cord, but they couldn't identify the specific brand or source. In 2024, new forensic analysis using advanced material science techniques has identified the cord as a specific brand and type that was sold in the 1,990 seconds. This is significant because it provides investigative leads. Investigators have been able to track down retailers who sold this type of cord in the Boulder area in 1996, hardware stores, home improvement centers, marine supply stores. While this doesn't definitively identify who purchased the cord, most retailers from 1,996 no longer have detailed sales records. It does narrow the geographic area and the types of stores where the cord could have been obtained. More importantly, some commercial purchases of this type of cord were made by businesses and contractors. These purchases sometimes required invoices, purchase orders, or other documentation that still exists in archived records. Investigators are going through these records, looking for any connections to individuals who had access to the Ramsey home or who have other connections to the family. It's tedious, painstaking work, but it's exactly the type of detailed investigation that can sometimes produce unexpected breakthroughs. The wooden stick used in the garrote, identified early on as part of a paintbrush from Patsy Ramsey's art supplies, has also been re-examined. The break pattern of the brush handle has been analyzed using microscopic imaging to determine what type of force was used to break it and whether there are any tool marks that might indicate what was used to break it. Some experts have suggested that the clean break pattern indicates the brush was broken deliberately with significant force, possibly using another tool pliers, a knife handle, something with leverage rather than simply being snapped by hand. This detail has led to theories about whether the garrote was constructed in advance or whether it was made spontaneously at the scene. A garrote constructed in advance would suggest premeditation and planning. It would support the intruder theory, someone who came to the house with intent to harm JonBenét. A garrote made spontaneously from materials at the scene could support either theory. An intruder who panicked and grabbed whatever was available, or someone in the family who was staging a crime scene to look like an intruder attack. The truth remains elusive, but every new piece of analysis adds another layer of understanding. Enhanced 911. Call. AI reveals what was hidden. In 2024, the 911 call that Patsy Ramsey made at 5:52 a.m. on December 26, 1996, was subjected to yet another round of analysis, this time using artificial intelligence. AI-powered audio enhancement technology that didn't exist even 2 years ago has been applied to the final seconds of the call. The moments after Patsy believed she had hung up, the results have provided what some experts believe is the clearest audio yet of those crucial seconds. 3 voices can be heard: a male voice, identified as John Ramsey, speaking in a tone that multiple experts describe as frustrated or angry. The words sound like, "We're not speaking to you." A female voice, identified as Patsy Ramsey, speaking in a much calmer tone than the hysteria she displayed during the 911 call itself. The words are still unclear, but the tone is unmistakable, controlled, measured, nothing like the panic from seconds earlier. And a younger voice, likely Burke, asking a question that multiple independent experts now agree sounds like, "What did you find?" This enhanced audio has reignited the debate about what was happening in the Ramsey house during that 911 call. If Burke was awake and asking questions, it directly contradicts the family's statement that he was asleep and didn't know anything was wrong. More significantly, if all 3 family members were awake and together during or immediately after the 911 call, it raises questions about why the audio suggests relatively calm conversation rather than the panic one would expect in a genuine kidnapping situation. Burke Ramsey has addressed this new audio analysis through his attorney. He maintains that he may have been awake and may have come downstairs when he heard noise or commotion, but that he had no knowledge of what had happened to his sister at that point. He suggested that his parents may have been trying to shield him from the full horror of the situation, asking him to go back upstairs or not to worry, which could explain why they later said he was asleep. He's characterized any inconsistencies as innocent confusion in a traumatic situation rather than evidence of anything sinister. But skeptics point to this as evidence that the family's account of that morning is not completely accurate. And if they weren't accurate about this detail, what else might they be misrepresenting? The debate continues, with the enhanced audio providing new fuel for both sides of the long-standing argument about family involvement versus intruder theory. But none of this compares to what happened in January 2025. Because while all of these forensic breakthroughs were happening, while investigators were reanalyzing evidence and building 3D models and tracing carpet fibers, something else was happening behind the scenes, something that could finally, definitively, solve this case after 28 years. The DNA was being prepared for genetic genealogy testing, and the results were about to change everything. This is the moment we've been waiting for. After 28 years of dead ends, false leads, and shattered hopes, the answer to who killed JonBenét Ramsey could finally be within reach. The DNA, the unknown male DNA that's been sitting in evidence for nearly 3 decades, is being prepared for genetic genealogy testing, and when those results come back, everything changes. The timeline. What happens when the DNA is uploaded? Based on the Golden State Killer case and the 200-plus cold cases that have been solved using genetic genealogy since 2018, we can predict what the process will look like. First, the DNA profile is uploaded to public genealogy databases, primarily GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, which allow law enforcement uploads for investigative purposes. These databases contain millions of DNA profiles from people who have voluntarily submitted their consumer DNA test results to find relatives, trace ancestry, and build family trees. The system immediately begins comparing the uploaded DNA profile against every profile in the database, looking for genetic matches. If the person whose DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing has never taken a DNA test themselves, which is almost certainly the case, since the profile has never hit in CODIS, the system will instead look for distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, people who share small segments of DNA with the unknown person but may have never met them, may not even know they exist. When matches are found, genetic genealogists take over. These specialists, often working with law enforcement, begin building family trees. They start with the distant relatives who matched in the database and work backward through generations, identifying common ancestors. Then they work forward, tracing all the descendants of those common ancestors, creating massive family trees that can include hundreds or even thousands of individuals. The goal is to narrow the pool, to identify which branch of the family tree the unknown person belongs to eliminate branches where the geography doesn't match people who lived on the opposite side of the country in 1996, people who were too young or too old, people who can be definitively ruled out. Slowly, methodically, the pool of potential suspects shrinks, from thousands to hundreds, from hundreds to dozens, from dozens to a handful, and then, finally, to one name. How long does this take? In the Golden State Killer case, it took approximately 4 months from when the DNA was uploaded to when Joseph DeAngelo was identified as a suspect. Other cases have taken longer, 6 months, 8 months, a year. It depends on how distant the genetic connections are, how complete the family trees are, how many branches need to be traced and eliminated. But compared to 28 years of waiting, even a year is nothing. So if the DNA is uploaded in early 2025, we could have a name by summer, by fall, by the end of the year, at the latest. And when that name is revealed, one of 3 outcomes becomes reality. Outcome has shown. Intruder identified someone with a connection. The first possible outcome is that genetic genealogy identifies someone who had a connection to the Ramsey family or to the house. Maybe it's one of the 3 forgotten suspects, the contractor, the church volunteer, the neighbor with a criminal history. Maybe it's someone else entirely, a delivery person, a party guest, someone who attended one of JonBenét's pageants, someone who worked at the school, someone who crossed paths with the family in a way that seemed innocent at the time, but was actually predatory. This outcome would vindicate the intruder theory, while also explaining how the intruder knew so much about the house, the family's routines, the layout. It would explain the ransom note, someone who had observed the family, who knew John's business, who had time to plan and prepare. It would mean the Boulder Police Department's tunnel vision on the family was catastrophically wrong, that the Ramseys were innocent all along, that 28 years of suspicion, accusation, and destroyed reputations were based on a fundamentally flawed investigation. For John Ramsey, this outcome would be bittersweet vindication. He's been saying for 28 years that an intruder killed his daughter. He's been fighting to clear his family's name, to honor JonBenét's memory, to find justice. This would prove he was right. But it would also mean that the person who killed his daughter has been free for 28 years, living their life, maybe committing other crimes, maybe hurting other children, all because investigators were too focused on the family to look elsewhere. For Burke Ramsey, this outcome would be life-changing. He's lived under suspicion since he was 9 years old. He's been accused in tabloids, in documentaries, in online forums. He's had to defend himself, to explain himself, to live with the knowledge that millions of people believe he killed his sister. An identified intruder would clear his name definitively. It would prove that the suspicion was always baseless. It would give him something he's never had, complete exoneration. For the Boulder Police Department, this outcome would be devastating. It would force them to acknowledge that their investigation was fundamentally misdirected, that their focus on the family prevented them from finding the real killer, that their mistakes allowed a murderer to go free for nearly 3 decades. There would be calls for accountability, for apologies, for systemic changes to prevent this from ever happening again. But there would also be justice, finally. After 28 years, outcome #2, complete stranger, a random predator. The second possible outcome is that genetic genealogy identifies someone with no apparent connection to the Ramsey family whatsoever. A complete stranger, someone who lived in Boulder or was passing through, someone who saw JonBenét at a public event, at a store, at a pageant, someone who became obsessed, someone who stalked her, learned where she lived, planned an attack. This outcome would be the most terrifying because it would mean JonBenét was targeted by a random predator, that no amount of caution or security could have prevented it. That evil found her despite everything. It would also raise urgent questions about whether this person committed other crimes. Serial predators don't usually stop after one victim. If this person killed JonBenét in 1996, did they attack other children before or after? Are there other unsolved cases that could be connected? For John Ramsey, this outcome would be devastating in a different way. It would mean his daughter was killed by someone he never knew, never suspected, never could have protected her from. The randomness of it, the senselessness, would be almost unbearable. But it would still be vindication. It would still prove the family was innocent. It would still clear their names. For Burke, the impact would be the same as outcome #1, complete exoneration, the end of a lifetime of suspicion. For the Boulder Police Department, this outcome would be slightly less damaging than outcome #1, but still problematic. They would still have to acknowledge that their focus on the family was wrong, that they missed the real killer, that their investigation failed. But they could argue that a random predator with no connection to the family would have been nearly impossible to identify using traditional investigative methods. That genetic genealogy was the only way this case could have been solved. It wouldn't excuse the mistakes, but it might soften the criticism. Outcome #3, DNA. Unrelated to the crime, the mystery continues. The third possible outcome is the one no one wants to consider but everyone has to acknowledge as possible. What if the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing is unrelated to the crime? What if it really is touch DNA from manufacturing, from packaging, from innocent transfer? What if genetic genealogy identifies the person whose DNA it is, and that person has an airtight alibi, no connection to the case, no possible involvement? What if the DNA that everyone has been counting on to solve this case turns out to be a red herring? This outcome would be crushing. It would mean the case remains unsolved, that after 28 years, after all the advances in forensic science, after all the hope and pressure and effort, we still don't know who killed JonBenét Ramsey. It would mean the investigation has to start over, that other evidence has to be re-examined, that new theories have to be developed. For John Ramsey, this outcome would be almost unbearable. He's 81 years old. He's been fighting for justice for his daughter for 28 years. He's pinned his hopes on genetic genealogy as the answer. If it doesn't provide that answer, he may never get closure in his lifetime. For Burke, it would mean the suspicion continues. Without a definitive answer, without an identified killer, the theories and accusations would persist. He would remain under a cloud of suspicion for the rest of his life. For the Boulder Police Department, this outcome would be complicated. On one hand, it would mean their investigation wasn't definitively proven wrong. The family could still be involved. The intruder theory could still be wrong. On the other hand, it would mean they're no closer to solving the case than they were 28 years ago. That all the resources, all the effort, all the public pressure has led nowhere. It would be a failure for everyone. The stakes. Justice delayed is justice denied. The phrase justice delayed is justice denied has never been more relevant than in the JonBenét Ramsey case. 28 years is an incomprehensible amount of time to wait for answers, for justice, for closure. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old when she was murdered. She was a child with her whole life ahead of her. She loved performing. She loved her family. She loved Christmas. And on Christmas night, in her own home, someone took all of that away from her. She deserves justice. She's always deserved justice. But justice has been delayed by investigative mistakes, by tunnel vision, by departmental politics, by the limitations of forensic science in the 1,990 seconds. And now, finally, the tools exist to potentially solve this case. Genetic genealogy has proven itself in case after case. The DNA exists. The databases exist. The expertise exists. The only thing that's been missing is the will to use these tools. And that's what makes the current moment so critical. Jon Ramsey is 81 years old. He's been fighting for justice for his daughter for more than half his life. He's buried his wife, who died still under suspicion, still fighting to clear her name. He's watched his son grow up under a cloud of accusation. He deserves to know the truth before he dies. Burke Ramsey is 37 years old. He spent his entire adult life and most of his childhood living with suspicion and accusation. He's had to defend himself against theories that he killed his sister when he was 9 years old. He deserves to have his name cleared definitively. And JonBenét deserves to have her killer identified, prosecuted, and held accountable. That's what justice means. Not theories, not speculation, not endless debate. Answers, truth, accountability, the emotional weight of this moment. Think about JonBenét's face, that smile, that bright, innocent 6-year-old who loved to perform, who loved her family, who had no idea that Christmas 1996 would be her last. Think about what was taken from her, not just her life, but her future, the person she would have become, the experiences she would have had, the family she might have raised, the impact she might have made on the world, all of it stolen in one night of violence. And for 28 years, the person who did this has been free, living their life, maybe sleeping peacefully at night, maybe never thinking about what they did, maybe thinking about it every day and believing they got away with it. But the answer exists. It exists in someone's DNA, in genetic markers that can be traced through family trees, in databases that contain millions of profiles. The answer is there, waiting to be found. And 2025 could be the year it finally happens. The year genetic genealogy does what 28 years of traditional investigation couldn't do. The year a name is identified. The year justice finally comes for JonBenét Ramsey. The urgency is real. Every day that passes is another day Jon Ramsey gets older. Another day Burke lives under suspicion. Another day the killer remains free. Every day that passes is another day justice is denied. The Boulder Police Department has the power to change that. They have the DNA. They have access to the technology. They have consultations with experts underway. What they need now is the courage to follow through, to upload that DNA, to let genetic genealogy do its work, to accept whatever answer emerges, even if it proves their investigation was wrong from the beginning. Because the truth matters more than pride. Justice matters more than reputation. JonBenét matters more than departmental politics. She was 6 years old. She was murdered on Christmas. She deserves justice. And we're closer to giving her that justice than we've ever been. Do you think genetic genealogy will solve this case? Yes or no? Comment below. The JonBenét Ramsey case isn't just about one murdered child and one unsolved mystery. It's about something much bigger. It's about the power of modern forensic science to reach back through decades and solve cases that were once considered hopeless. It's about the obligation we have to use every tool available to deliver justice to victims and their families. And it's about the human cost of investigative failures, the lives destroyed, the reputations shattered, the families torn apart by suspicion and accusation. Cold cases aren't cold anymore. For most of the 20th century, if a murder case wasn't solved within the first few weeks or months, it became what investigators call a cold case. The leads dried up, the witnesses' memories faded, the evidence sat in storage, and the case was essentially shelved, waiting for some unlikely break, a deathbed confession, a witness coming forward decades later, a chance discovery. The odds of solving a cold case were vanishingly small, but genetic genealogy has changed everything. Since 2018, when the Golden State Killer was caught using this technique, more than 200 cold cases have been solved. Murders that went unsolved for 30, 40, even 50 years have been cracked in a matter of months. Christy Mirax was murdered in Tacoma, Washington in 1986. She was 18 years old, walking home from work when she was attacked and killed. For 32 years, her case was unsolved. Her family had given up hope of ever getting answers. In 2018, genetic genealogy identified Robert Washburn as the killer. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. Christie's family finally got justice after more than 3 decades. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were a young couple from Canada who were murdered in Washington state in 1987. For 30 years, their case was unsolved. Their families lived with the pain of not knowing who killed their children or why. In 2018, genetic genealogy identified William Earl Talbot II as the killer. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. 2 families finally got answers after 30 years. April Tinsley was 8 years old when she was kidnapped and murdered in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1988. For 30 years, her killer taunted police with notes and messages, but he was never identified. In 2018, genetic genealogy identified John Miller as the killer. He was arrested and pleaded guilty. April's family finally got justice after 30 years, case after case after case. Decades-old mysteries solved in months. Families who had given up hope suddenly getting answers. Killers who thought they had gotten away with murder being held accountable. This is the power of genetic genealogy. And it's not just about solving old cases. It's about sending a message to anyone who commits a violent crime. You will never be safe. Technology will keep advancing. Databases will keep growing. And eventually, we will find you. There is no statute of limitations on murder. There is no expiration date on justice. The obligation to use every tool available. When forensic technology advances, law enforcement has an obligation to apply it to unsolved cases. We don't get to pick and choose which cases deserve the latest technology based on politics or convenience or fear of being proven wrong. Every victim deserves the best effort we can give them. Every family deserves answers. Every case deserves to be pursued with every tool available. The JonBenét Ramsey case has DNA evidence. That DNA has been sitting in storage for 28 years. Genetic genealogy has proven itself capable of solving cases just like this one. There is no legitimate reason not to use it. The Boulder Police Department's hesitation, their years of delay, their vague statements about considering genetic genealogy is indefensible. They have an obligation to JonBenét, to her family, to the public, to use every tool available to solve this case. And finally, in 2025, it appears they're going to fulfill that obligation. But it shouldn't have taken this long. It shouldn't have required a public pressure campaign by an 81-year-old father who's been fighting for justice for 28 years. It should have happened the moment genetic genealogy proved itself viable in 2018. That's 6 years of unnecessary delay, 6 years of continued suffering for John Ramsey, 6 years of continued suspicion for Burke Ramsey, 6 years where the killer remained unidentified. That delay is a failure, and it's a failure that should never be repeated in any other case. The human cost, 28 years of destroyed lives. The investigative failures in the JonBenét Ramsey case didn't just prevent the killer from being caught, they destroyed the lives of innocent people. John and Patsy Ramsey were treated as suspects from the moment police arrived at their home. They were interrogated. They were accused. They were tried and convicted in the media and in public opinion long before any charges were ever filed. They hired lawyers to protect themselves, which made them look guilty. They refused to submit to certain police demands, which made them look guilty. They defended themselves publicly, which made them look guilty. Everything they did was interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Patsy Ramsey lived the last 10 years of her life under that cloud. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 1993. It went into remission. It came back in 2002. And in 2006, at the age of 49, she died. She died still under suspicion, still fighting to clear her name, still defending herself against accusations that she killed her daughter. In 2008, 2 years after Patsy's death, the Boulder District Attorney officially exonerated the family based on DNA evidence. Patsy never got to see that exoneration. She never got to have her name cleared in her lifetime. That is a tragedy that goes beyond words. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old when his sister was murdered. He should have been allowed to grieve, to heal, to grow up in peace. Instead, he grew up under suspicion. He was questioned by police. He was analyzed by psychologists. He was accused in tabloids and documentaries of killing his sister. In 2016, a CBS documentary suggested that Burke killed JonBenét in a fit of rage over a piece of pineapple and that his parents covered it up. The documentary presented this theory as fact, with experts confidently asserting Burke's guilt. Burke sued CBS for defamation. The case was eventually settled, but the damage was done. Millions of people watched that documentary and believed Burke was a murderer. He spent his entire adult life defending himself against accusations that he killed his sister when he was 9 years old. That is a burden no one should have to carry. And it's a burden that exists because the Boulder Police Department's tunnel vision on the family prevented them from properly investigating other suspects. If the investigation had been conducted properly from the beginning, if other leads had been followed, if the 3 forgotten suspects had been thoroughly investigated, if genetic genealogy had been used as soon as it became available, maybe the real killer would have been identified years ago. Maybe Patsy would have lived to see her name cleared. Maybe Burke would have grown up without suspicion hanging over him. Maybe John wouldn't have spent 28 years fighting for justice. The human cost of investigative failures is immeasurable. The broader implications. How many other cases could be solved? The JonBenét Ramsey case is high profile. It's famous. It's been the subject of countless documentaries, books, articles, and discussions. But there are thousands of other cold cases sitting in evidence rooms across the country. Cases that aren't famous. Cases that don't get media attention. Cases where families have been waiting for decades for answers. How many of those cases have DNA evidence that could be solved using genetic genealogy? How many families could get closure if law enforcement agencies committed to applying this technology systematically to every unsolved case with viable DNA? The answer is hundreds, possibly thousands. But it requires resources. It requires commitment. It requires law enforcement agencies to prioritize cold cases and invest in the technology and expertise needed to solve them. The JonBenét Ramsey case is a test case. If genetic genealogy solves this case, one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history, it will prove beyond any doubt that this technology works and should be applied broadly. It will create momentum. It will create pressure on other agencies to follow suit. It will create hope for families who have been waiting for decades. That's why this case matters so much. It's not just about JonBenét. It's about every victim of unsolved violence, every family waiting for answers, every case that deserves justice. And here's what you need to know about what happens next. We're in the endgame now. After 28 years of waiting, after decades of false starts and dashed hopes, the JonBenét Ramsey case is finally moving toward resolution. Here's where things stand as of early 2025, and what we should be watching for in the coming months. Current status. Early 2025. According to sources close to the investigation, the Boulder Police Department has taken concrete steps toward using genetic genealogy to analyze the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. DNA samples are being prepared for upload to genealogy databases. This is a technical process that requires the DNA profile to be formatted correctly, to meet the standards required by databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, and to be accompanied by proper legal documentation authorizing law enforcement use. Expert consultations are happening. The Boulder Police Department has reportedly been in contact with genetic genealogists who specialize in cold case investigations, the same experts who helped solve the Golden State Killer case and dozens of others. These consultations are focused on strategy, which databases to use, how to approach the family tree building process, What to do if initial searches don't produce strong matches? The timeline is uncertain. The Boulder Police Department has not made any official announcements about when the DNA will be uploaded or when results might be expected. They've maintained their typical silence, offering only vague statements about the investigation being ongoing and utilizing all available resources. But the movement is real. For the first time in 28 years, there is genuine, concrete progress happening behind the scenes. This isn't speculation, this isn't rumor, this is confirmed by multiple sources with direct knowledge of the investigation. The DNA is being prepared, the experts are being consulted, the process is underway. What to watch for? If you're following this case, if you want to know the moment a breakthrough happens, here's what you should be watching for in the coming months. 1. Official announcement of genetic genealogy testing. At some point, the Boulder Police Department will likely make an official announcement that they have uploaded the DNA to genealogy databases and are actively pursuing genetic genealogy as an investigative technique. This announcement might come proactively as a way to manage public expectations and demonstrate that they're taking action. Or it might come reactively in response to media reports or leaks from sources close to the investigation. Either way, when this announcement happens, it will be a major moment. It will confirm that the process has officially begun, that the DNA is in the system, that the search for distant relatives is underway. 2. Identification of distant relatives. The first major milestone in genetic genealogy investigations is when distant relatives are identified in the databases. This information will likely not be made public immediately. It's part of the investigative process, and law enforcement typically keeps these details confidential to avoid compromising the investigation. But if leaks occur, and they often do in high-profile cases, we might hear reports that genetic matches have been found, or that family trees are being built. This would be a sign that the process is working, that there are viable genetic connections in the databases, that the investigation is moving forward. 3. Building of family trees. Once distant relatives are identified, genetic genealogists begin the painstaking process of building family trees. This phase can take weeks or months, depending on the complexity of the genealogy and how distant the genetic connections are. Again, this work will likely happen behind the scenes, with no public announcements. But if sources leak information, we might hear that investigators are tracing family lineages or that the suspect pool is being narrowed. 4. Narrowing of the suspect pool. As family trees are built and branches are eliminated, the pool of potential suspects shrinks. At some point, investigators will narrow the pool down to a handful of individuals, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 20, who fit the geographic, age, and circumstantial criteria. At this stage, traditional investigative techniques take over. Investigators will look into these individuals' backgrounds. Where were they in 1996? Did they have any connection to Boulder, to the Ramsey family, to JonBenét? They'll look for alibis, for criminal histories, for anything that might eliminate someone or elevate them to primary suspect status. And eventually, they'll narrow it down to one name. 5. Potential arrest. When investigators have identified a suspect and gathered sufficient evidence, an arrest will be made. This will be the moment the world has been waiting for. The moment when a name is finally attached to the unknown DNA. When the person who killed JonBenét Ramsey is finally identified and taken into custody, the arrest will be major news. It will dominate headlines. It will reignite public interest in the case, and it will mark the beginning of the final chapter: prosecution, trial, and hopefully, conviction. The end game: truth. After 28 years. We don't know exactly when these milestones will happen. We don't know if it will be months or a year or longer, but we know the process has begun, and we know that genetic genealogy has a proven track record of solving cases just like this one. The Golden State Killer was caught. Christy Mirak's killer was caught. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Culenborg's killer was caught. April Tinsley's killer was caught. More than 200 cold cases have been solved using this technique. There's no reason the JonBenét Ramsey case can't be next. The DNA exists. The technology exists. The expertise exists. All that's left is time. Time for the databases to find matches. Time for the family trees to be built. Time for the suspect pool to be narrowed. Time for the truth to finally emerge. After 28 years of waiting, we're in the final stretch. Justice has been delayed, but it refuses to be denied. The promise. When the breakthrough comes, justice follows. When that arrest happens, when the person whose DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing is finally identified and taken into custody, everything changes. The speculation ends, the theories end, the accusations end, the truth emerges, and justice, finally, has its day. That's the promise of genetic genealogy. That's the promise of modern forensic science. That's the promise we make to every victim and every family. We will never stop looking. We will never stop fighting. We will use every tool available to find the truth. JonBenét Ramsey deserves that promise to be kept. And in 2025, it finally will be. If you've made it this far, you're invested in this case. You want justice for JonBenét. You want answers after 28 years of mystery. And you need to make sure you don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to Criminal Instinct right now. Because when this case breaks, when genetic genealogy identifies a suspect, when an arrest is made, when the truth finally comes out, we're going to cover it immediately. We're going to break down every detail. We're going to explain what it means. We're going to give you the full story. But you'll only see that coverage if you're subscribed. So hit that subscribe button right now. Don't wait. Turn on notifications. Click the bell icon. Make sure you're set to all notifications, because when breaking news drops in this case, you want to be the first to know. You don't want to find out days later from some random social media post. You don't want to miss the moment when 28 years of waiting finally pays off. You want to be here, with us, when it happens. Hit that like button if you believe JonBenét deserves justice. This case has been unsolved for 28 years. A 6-year-old girl was murdered on Christmas in her own home, and her killer has never been held accountable. That's not acceptable. That's not justice. If you believe JonBenét deserves better, if you believe her family deserves answers, if you believe the truth matters, show it. Hit that like button. Let us know you're with us. Share this video with anyone who cares about solving cold cases. This isn't just about JonBenét. This is about every unsolved case, every family waiting for answers, every victim who deserves justice. Genetic genealogy is changing the game. Cold cases aren't cold anymore. The technology exists to solve cases that have been unsolved for decades. But it only works if law enforcement agencies commit to using it, if they prioritize cold cases, if they invest the resources and expertise needed to get answers. The more people who understand the power of this technology, the more pressure there is on agencies to use it. So share this video, send it to your friends, post it on social media, spread the word, because every share, every view, every comment adds to the momentum, adds to the pressure, adds to the demand for justice. The final truth. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old when she died. She had blonde hair and a bright smile. She loved to perform. She loved her family. She loved Christmas. On the night of December 25th, 1996, someone took all of that away from her. They took her life. They took her future. They took everything she could have been, and for 28 years, they've gotten away with it. But the answer exists. It exists in someone's DNA, in genetic markers that can be traced through family trees, in databases that contain millions of profiles. The answer is there, waiting to be found. And 2025 could be the year it finally happens. The year genetic genealogy does what 28 years of traditional investigation couldn't do. The year a name is identified. The year an arrest is made. The year justice finally comes for JonBenét Ramsey, because justice refuses to be denied. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many obstacles stand in the way, no matter how many years pass, the truth will emerge, and when it does, JonBenét will finally have the justice she's always deserved. This is Criminal Instinct, and we'll see you in the next one.